Carrie Hyde. I'm your host. And tonight we have Dr. Robin Cannizzaro with us, who is a holistic homeopathic veterinarian. I always say she's like the double threat because, well, actually we could call her a triple threat because she's also very, very, very compassionate. And believe it or not, I've seen that go to the wayside with some veterinarians where they lose the compassion. And so to have a vet with this much time and experience who's compassionate, homeopathic, and holistic, it's a triple threat. So I'm very excited every time she's on the show. So welcome to the show, Dr. Cannizzaro. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well, thank you. Busy and, I was trying to get ready for the podcast. It was kind of a real scrunch from finishing work to jumping right in. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. And I also appreciate your acknowledgement of that. I want to say, not to be somber or anything, but people don't realize that one of the highest groups of suicide is actually veterinarians.
Yep.
And I think one of the hardest things we deal with, and I deal with it as a homeopathic veterinarian, in fact, I did recently as well, is it's really hard. Like if things get difficult or if an animal's really sick or think the outcome isn't what the client is hoping for, it's so common, for people to get angry at the veterinarian and then accuse us it's all about the money. And I pour my heart and soul into trying my hardest to make the life of the beautiful life in front of me, this sentient being in front of me, as well as I can. But, we're not gods. So we can carry a lot of guilt for things not going as successfully or as inexpensively or as whatever. So that's been heavy on my mind because I've had a recent encounter with regard to that. So I appreciate that statement by you because it really helps to lift us up. Because the majority of my clients I'm so blessed. I have amazing clients. And it's not that those clients are bad. It's just they're focusing their upset and anger at the easiest person they can. And that makes it hard for us. And if we don't talk about it, then it goes unspoken about, and veterinarians isolate themselves, which we tend to be isolated anyway. So that's not what we were going to talk about tonight, but I think it's a good thing for your listeners to know. So if your veterinarian really does work hard for you, appreciate them and, say things to them, because it's incredible for those of us that really pour our hearts into it. It's really nice to hear those wonderful things when we have the pleasure of getting to hear that from our great clients. And it will help to offset, the wrinkles in the road, again, who are not bad people, but people that have gotten angry or upset for whatever their reasons are. And it's not that they're invalid reasons. It's just that, it's not always the veterinarian's fault. So anyway, I'm going to leave that alone because we have a lot of fun stuff we're going to cover tonight. And I hope it's going to be interesting for the listeners.
It always is. And I am glad. And it is a topic that it should be talked about. And we could start talking a little bit about that because it is, I would actually even be interested in vet techs and everybody in the veterinary world, not just the veterinarians, but I'd be interested to see how much pressure is put on a vet tech, on the receptionist who, forgot to tell the vet to do this, and then she gets blamed. And so everybody gets kind of this blame game that goes on. And it really, especially when you're dealing with people who are by nature compassionate, like people who are not, animal lovers don't generally get into this business. Though I did work for one vet who I think he just did it because he was told to do it. I don't think he ever loved animals. Like it was just very weird.
I actually worked for one of those once.
Yeah.
And he was a super businessman, but he was a horrible vet. And I did regular relief work in his practice, and it was just terrible. I mean, all he ever did was give steroids and antibiotics.
Yeah.
He hardly worked cases up because that just took too much energy and effort.
Yep.
And they would that's what they would get until they just didn't do okay anymore. But he'd push shampoos and flea and tick poisons and all kinds of stuff. But it was quite fascinating because he really didn't care that much about animals.
Yeah.
I think he liked the title and liked the doctor thing, but and I think that he was, if I'm not mistaken, I think he was like an engineer or something. I mean, not a stupid guy.
Right.
Just a terrible vet. And I saw some terrible things behind the scenes. which goes into what we talk about also, because when you are working for other veterinarians, your hands are largely tied. I mean, if you rat out the veterinarian for doing something really awful, then you've lost your job, and you've built a rapport with this individual, whether you truly respect them or not. Because I respected him as a business person, but not so much as a veterinarian.
Right.
And the thing is, he would go in and just snow the clients incredibly. I mean, they just all loved him, and he would tell stories and carry on, and he would get them to really trust him. And I don't think that he did it maliciously. I think he just wasn't a very good diagnostician, and he just made bad decisions, and it cost animals lives. But I got to tell you, to come home with that knowledge was incredibly difficult. I mean, what do you do with that? How do you
Yeah.
unload it, or how do you get rid of that? And how do you stop something like that from happening?
Yeah, I
And
don't know.
it would be my word against his, right?
Sure.
So even if I did turn him in, there would be no guarantee that anything would ever happen. And then I'd lose a job and have a bad scar on me, a big scarlet, stay away from this vet. Don't ever hire this one. So, it's tough no matter. And I bet you techs see that too. That's got to be very
Absolutely.
difficult. And receptionists.
Yeah.
And the receptionist job is really thankless, because they are getting the telephone calls from the people that want to get in and be seen quickly. Maybe they can't be accommodated that way, and they're angry. So of course, who are they going to scream at? They're going to scream at the receptionist.
I don't
I'm
even
the
have yeah, my receptionists get yelled at more than, like, constantly.
Right.
People calling and upset and angry and accusing, and we get that a lot. They take on a lot. And it's really, it's so unfortunate that that's the world we listen to. Just a little side note, if anybody's listening, and even for you, Dr. Cannizzaro, there is a woman I listen to. Her name's Brene Brown. Have you heard of her?
Yes, I think I have.
She's really amazing. She talks about, if they're not in your arena, then you have to just let it go. So she talks about the cheap seats, especially when she makes comments about people on social media who attack. And we could even take that out of social media, and just, when people are calling you and they don't understand why you did this for your pet or why you made that decision, and they think it's all about money, it's because they're not in the arena. They're not actually faced with those things. And so I think for people like us and for veterinarians to be able to understand that we can't take that home with us because they're not in our arena. That's why I listen to her a lot. It's helpful.
Well, my commitment, and not that I've listened to her necessarily, but her name is familiar, so I may have.
Yeah.
I really endeavor, no matter what, to try to help people find the places that are right for them.
Yeah.
If here isn't right for them, it's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I don't have emotion and a couple sleepless nights over it, because I'm always searching as a compassionate individual. How could I have done things differently? And at the end of the day, I'm very transparent. I'm very honest. I speak very honestly to clients, and if it doesn't go well, it's really hard, because I'm thinking, I can't think of anything that I could do ostensibly differently. And I was sort of strapped, there was some financial constraints. So there was a limit to some of the things I could have done, the amount of follow-ups, et cetera. So there are things that we just don't have control over as veterinarians. And we don't want to turn around and blame those individuals. Everybody has baggage. And when I have assistants working with me, I always tell them, if somebody calls and they're just really nasty on the phone, just do your best and be really nice and polite. And it's not that you have to suck it up and swallow it. I never want to be in a position where somebody is going to say, well, that was nasty, or that tech was nasty to me and they were rude on the phone. If someone's going to be rude to me, that's fine. Hopefully we can move on from each other sooner the better. And again, not because anyone's better than the other. It's just that, it isn't what we need in a day-to-day healthy environment. And I will say that a lot of veterinary offices are incredibly dysfunctional, very damaged environments, and very toxic environments. Yeah. And, one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is veterinarians, we don't get any training about business. We get no training with regard to business. So running a business and managing, managing individuals, et cetera, that's hard. It's hard even when you're trained in doing it. But what about if you're not even trained doing it? And what we really should be doing is practicing veterinary medicine, and not trying to field, everybody's baggage. And then when you hire people, you don't know what baggage they may have. I'm
No.
not going to sit in an interview to hire somebody and say, tell me your worst baggage.
Yeah.
And would they tell me the truth anyway? And it's none of my business, really. So it's a hard thing to do. I mean, right now I'm working by myself, which is stressful in its own right, but I've had a hard time trying to find somebody really good to join me in my office. So anybody out there, if you're really good, then feel free to reach out to me, because I'd be delighted.
I swear, I got to go out there. I always say it. One day I'm going to come out there and work
just for a couple of weeks. Absolutely, you must. You just must.
I know. I will.
I'm so blessed. I love what I do, and I do want to cover some of the topic that you had mentioned.
Yeah.
Before we started the podcast, because I think that being a homeopathic veterinarian, it's incredibly important to touch on this topic, because it is something that, and this came up too, believe it or not, in the discourse that occurred, last week, and some this week with, the issue with the client. And so I think it's a really good topic to cover, even to segue into. So we should talk about it. We talked about, your listeners may not know, but we discussed the possibility of talking somewhat about research. So anyway, I think that know that your veterinarian might be under a lot more stress than you give them credit for. We're under a great deal of pressure. Things have changed a lot since COVID. It's made things much more challenging for us in many respects, and for staff. And it's making it harder for us to find qualified, really good people to join in our practice, whether it's an associate veterinarian or a technician or a receptionist. It's just tough. It's really difficult to find people. And so be kind, especially if you like your veterinarian.
Yeah. So what Dr. Cannizzaro is talking about is that I always, before we go live, behind stage or whatever we're going to call it, before we go live, we never really know what we're going to be talking about, but I usually have something in mind. Here you go, Sherry. Oh, she'd be a good one too.
Oh, Sherry, I don't know where you are, but do come.
Canada.
Love for you. Love. And it looks like she's maybe a vet tech.
Yeah. Vets are very stressed, always polite, and try even when I don't agree with them. Yeah, I think it's the whole community that is just unbelievably stressed, from the receptionist to the vet tech to the kennel attendant to the vet to the, the sad part. And I think why the suicide rates are really high in vets is because the buck stops there, right? Like it does stop there. But she's a nurse. We can't forget the fact that, a lot of vets, I worked for one. Yeah, the buck stopped with him, but trust me, it got sent down my way a lot when he knew that whatever's going on, he would try to find blame. He never, ever took any responsibility for anything that he did. So he was constantly blaming us for everything, and also would never listen to us. So we would tell him things and he would tell us, no, later. And then we'd go to lunch thinking he had it. And then no one told me. And we're like, well, we tried to tell you, those kind of things. So
the other reason the suicide rate is so high in veterinary medicine is because unlike working in a hospital, when you work in a hospital in the human, doctor world, you're usually, or even in a doctor's office, you're surrounded by a lot of employees on a day-to-day basis. A lot of veterinarians have, obviously, if it's a corporate practice, it's going to be a lot more. But your independent veterinarians have a small amount of technicians. They are, I don't even want to use this word because there's no such thing. They're, in a way, considered inferior, like lower employees. And so if, for instance, a technician knows or notices or is aware that a veterinarian is abusing substances, for example, they're not going to say anything because it's going to be the loss of their job. They could be vilified. And it's a very isolationist place in a small veterinary practice, because the veterinarian, they may have troubles at home. They may not have a good support system at home. There's a tremendous amount of divorce that occurs, not only in vet school, but also, in veterinary medicine, both men and women. And it's very challenging. So veterinarians really don't have much of an opportunity to have intervention, like a lot of other, medical fields are likely to have. There may be other colleague doctors, et cetera. There may be a busy doctor office with many nurses, and So there's a hierarchy that shouldn't really exist because every individual in a practice is incredibly valuable. So I don't want you to take it the wrong way. But there is something to be said, who's paying the bills, who's paying your salary. And that would be the veterinarian is paying the bills, paying salary. So it does make a difference. And we've lost a lot of colleagues, sometimes very surprisingly, to suicide. And it's really a big deal in the field. There's also a lot of veterinarians getting so upset, young ones, I'll add, who are leaving the field because they can't take it. The stress is too much. The complaints of clients and the bitterness of clients is too difficult, and they're leaving the field. I know a lot of nurses are leaving the field, but they're overwhelmed, in the hospitals because the patient to nurse ratio is absurd, and you can't possibly provide the best of service. And we are all caregivers, my friends. So when you're a caregiver like that, it's incredibly stressful when you feel like you haven't been able to do your optimal best. And most of the time, we're our worst critics. And I'm sure nurses are as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sure MDs are too, as well as us DVMs. So,
yeah. So before we went live, I had mentioned to Dr. Cannizzaro that I would really like to touch on research because we are constantly told from the other side, if that's the only other way I can think to say it, from the other side. And that, I hate to say it that way because I do like research. I do like studies. I don't want to say that for studies and against study. I don't want to make it that black and white, but it's frustrating for someone like me who relies a lot on my experience. Over and over and over, I do something and over it works. And I don't have a study for it, but I try to explain this. Listen, this just works. I don't have a study for it. And the other side will say, no, there's no study for it, so therefore it doesn't work. So why I wanted to talk to Dr. Cannizzaro is because she's done a lot in the research world. So she's done so much for this. So I thought she could help us out a little bit about how much weight should we put into it? How easy, I guess my real question is, how easy is it to skew a study in with respect to animals? What do you think?
Whether it's humans or animals, it's very easy. We have to, the thing about research and double-blind studies is, and I'll back up for 1 second. I was a medical technician essentially before going to veterinary school for a renovascular hypertension doctor at the University of Florida and the Veterans Administration in Gainesville, Florida. And I worked there for a while. It really was an incredible experience because he was one of the honest ones. I'm going to tell you who pays the bills, who pays the salary of the assistants, the medical technicians, the researcher, the MD for that matter. Who pays the bills? The person who's asked you to do a double-blind study on their product, whatever that product is. So if anybody wants to believe that that's the gold standard, I would argue that it is very much not a gold standard. And I don't want to rock anybody's world because it's so relied upon, and even in veterinary medicine, it's considered the gold standard. But it's so absolutely grossly incorrect. And I worked side by side with other individuals that were working for other investigators. And those investigators actually, I don't want to say, how do you say forced? I guess forced is a good word because they're getting their salaries paid for, to falsify data on important drugs like heart drugs for humans. And while we were doing animal studies, understand that the results that we get have to be analyzed and determined if they're statistically significant. That means that more likely than not, that medication, most of the time it's medications, that medication made a statistical difference in what we were going for. So in our case, we were looking at high blood pressure as it relates to kidney disease and or diabetes, because he had lots of diabetic patients. And we did both human studies and also studies using rats. And I got to tell you, that's hard. It is hard to do experimentation on animals, and it definitely rocked my world. And then my world got even more rocked in vet school because we had to do terrible things to animals to learn surgeries. And we can go into that if you want to. And that is something that, I mean, if you have a heart and you have empathy, it's just hard to do. The human studies, that wasn't hard to do, because none of the human studies were going to get killed at the end of the
Right.
study. And they would go about their daily business of being as sick as they always were. So we were studying drugs for that purpose. And my investigator that I worked with, he was very honest. And I was working with him. I was doing surgery on rats, microsurgery. And I was infusing and collecting blood and urine samples from the rats before and after the use of this infusion of this drug that is supposed to help lower blood pressure. And the bottom line is the drug didn't work. And guess what? Our salary is getting paid for. He analyzed the data every which way to Sunday that he could, which is fair, but pay attention to that. What does that mean? Well, that means that we may be able to find a way in which we can examine the data so that it can look more favorable than not. And in this particular case, there was no favorability. There was no statistical difference between the controls that didn't get any drug to the animals that did get drug. And there was no statistical difference. So he had to conclude that the drug was not helpful. And in fact, most of my rats died after I infused, not most, but a good portion of them died after infusion of the drug. So it didn't appear to be terribly safe either. And so he had to make that conclusion as well, because we had such an enormous amount. And that was painful. And then you had to move on to the next rat, just like, I don't know, a bad sewing pattern, right? And so you have to discard that and go on to the next person, try to sew better. I don't know. It wasn't a surgical failure. It was just a failure of the medication. So we need to move away from the idea that double-blind studies are so important. Now, the reason that I link this up with the hard incident that I had, and I think is worth mentioning, is that this isn't the first person that's ever said this to me either, is that the individual accused me of using experimental medicine, meaning that there was no validity to the medicine I was using. And
currently, you mean the homeopathic medicine you use today?
Yes.
Oh,
exactly.
I would love to have been in the room for you to respond to this.
Yeah. Well, I welcome them to go online and look at the multitude of research studies. Additionally, homeopathic medicine is regulated by the FDA. Now,
Right.
They are trying to reclassify it so that people over the counter cannot gain access and try to restrict our ability to practice this kind of medicine. But this medicine's been around a long time. And I also bring this up because if we're going to rely on double-blind studies, I will freely admit that double-blind studies are very difficult with homeopathy.
Can you just explain to everybody exactly what a double-blind study is?
Sure. A double-blind study means that you have a control group, and let's say it's people, because animals don't have any idea if they're receiving a drug or not receiving a drug. You treat both of those groups identically, but one of the groups of individuals don't get any medication. The other group does get the medication, and then you measure the intended result. In other words, if it's going to be a drug to lower blood pressure or something like that, then we would expect to see a statistical difference in the group that actually received the drug. And so in the study case that we did of this particular drug, I don't remember the name of it, doesn't matter because it never made it to the market, as far as I know. As far as when I was involved, anyway, it certainly didn't. There was no statistical difference. There was no blood pressure change whatsoever with the use of the drug and the control group, which is the control group is the group that doesn't get any medication. And in the case, what they would do for humans is give like a placebo pill. So in the case of the human studies that were done through my investigator, there was a radioactive dye that was injected. And what he would do is just do a control group where, they would get an injection, but it didn't have any of the radioactive dye, or, it did, but no drug was ever administered. So both would get the radioactive dye, and one group would get the drug, the other group wouldn't. And we would use the radioactive dye to be able to measure the clearance and the reduction of blood pressure if there was any. I'm oversimplifying because I don't want to get into the technicalities of that, because it'll be
that's good.
Really boring. So a double-blind study is intended to have a control group and a group that does get the medication. The interesting thing with homeopathy is that if you are sick, let's say you have gastrointestinal disease, you have a problem with heartburn. Let's just take that as an example. And if you have heartburn, not everyone with heartburn is going to get the same medication. So maybe in human medicine, everybody would get Prilosec, and maybe you'd have a control group that wouldn't get Prilosec, but they'd get a placebo pill, which, they didn't know if it was or wasn't Prilosec. And then they would measure how everybody was doing with, with gastric reflux. And excuse me, in animals, we don't necessarily have to do that. But the double-blind studies are with homeopathy. It's hard to do because not everybody with acid reflux is going to get the same remedy. We have to work that individual up individually because there may be as many as 100, 200 homeopathic medicines that would actually treat reflux or heartburn, however you want to say it. And so it's hard to do a double-blind study because you can't just take one acid reflux remedy and give it to everyone because it may not work. It may not be homeopathic to that particular individual.
Would you have to find like 15 people with the exact same symptoms?
They could still have the exact same symptoms. So for instance, if you have, let's just take a dog, for instance, that has chronic diarrhea. And we have 5 dogs. They all have chronic diarrhea. One of them is like super outgoing. They're going to jump all over you and lick your face like crazy. They have diarrhea. They don't act sick with it. You can have another dog that doesn't act sick with diarrhea. They have crazy diarrhea, but they're really shy. They're really timid. They don't really want to go up to the same, to all people. They're not that social. They're not going to get the same remedy. We need a homeopathic medicine that's homeopathic to that patient that both has timidity and shyness and diarrhea.
That's what I meant. The write-up would have to be the same.
Going and has diarrhea. Those are going to be 2 different remedies.
Right. That's what that's what I meant is like each one of them would have to have the same exact write-up in order for you to do a study, right? Everything. Shy, timid, cold.
But even if you have outgoing dogs, they may not all be the same remedy because we're going to take into consideration every little tiny aspect, historic, in today's time, every aspect of that particular individual. And the best studied remedy with double-blind study has been arnica because that one is a really huge trauma remedy. So your acute homeopathic medicines are a little bit easier to do a double-blind study because there will be more people with injuries that will respond positively to arnica than there would be, dogs with chronic diarrhea that would respond to one individual remedy. Because the acute injuries, the acute things that happen, typically don't have as much complexity to their case. It's a simpler case. But we can't prove every single homeopathic medicine because not every single one is going to be appropriate for acute ailments and injuries. Or ailments, period. I should say injuries.
It's interesting because metronidazole came on the market, I don't know how long ago. But whenever it did, it came out with these so-called studies that it's this miracle cure for diarrhea and you can give it to your dogs for diarrhea. Well, another study came out only a couple years ago, and that study actually proved that if you I've talked about this a lot because I was so interested in this study. That study said that if you gave metronidazole to a dog with diarrhea, and that's the only symptom, the dog's acting normal, everything's fine, he's just got diarrhea. You give him metronidazole, the diarrhea will clear up in 3 days. But if you do nothing, the diarrhea will clear up in 3 days. So it was interesting because it's like the diarrhea is just clearing up on his own with or without the metronidazole. But without the metronidazole, you're not doing the harm to the gut. So it's that.
Well, remember what I said about double-blind studies, and the studies are particularly flawed these days too because we have a small sample size. Right. What that means is if you read most of the inserts of drugs, if anybody cared to do that, and I encourage you to, ask your vet for the insert.
I do.
If you look at the drugs, you'll notice that the sample size might be like 12 or 20 dogs.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Thousands and thousands of dogs with metronidazole, right? Yeah. And so they're finding a statistical difference between the control group and maybe a half a dozen or a dozen dogs. Secondly, over a very short period of time. So when they studied Rimadyl, they said it was the miracle drug for arthritis. and that you could use it long term with absolutely no side effects. It was totally safe, but the sample size was small and the duration of the study was short. It was like maybe 6 months.
Yeah.
And then now where are we? Now they have to admit one of the side effects of Rimadyl is death. Because guess what? Once they unleashed it on the public, they determined, when enough people complain, or maybe lawsuits or whatever, but usually those don't go too far with the pharmaceutical companies. They have deep, deep, deep pockets. But anyway, they have really good lawyers.
Well, we saw that with DCM, right? DCM, they came out saying there was going to be a study, and it was how they asked for those dogs. My understanding is they had veterinarians ask, do you have a dog with DCM who's eating a grain-free food? So they created that's what they looked for. So what they were looking for, they got. And when they got it, so it wasn't even a fair sample size.
Well, that's a very, very flawed study because there is no control group. You can do retrospective studies, which means you go back in the literature or medical records or whatever, and you compile similarities and what individuals have been on. The other thing to bear in mind is that the grain-free, absolute craze has been going on for quite some time. So what are the chances that most people are feeding grain-free when it was supposed to be the absolute best? And excuse me, a lot. So your sample size is going to be overrepresented from the individuals that are buying foods that have grain, which, by the way, is healthier, but there's no such thing as a healthy kibble, so we can get me started on that.
Well, I was laughing because Sherry says, don't get me started on food.
Yeah. And the other thing is, the study never looked at anything, as far as I know anyway, and I may be wrong, but I don't believe the study ever looked at home-prepared food, which included grains or grain-free. To my knowledge, I don't think there were any that were on whole real food that represented with dilated cardiomyopathy, in case people want to know what DCM.
Yeah, they didn't look at the raw diet either. They didn't look at all these animals who are just eating meat and raw diet. It wasn't even put in there. So
another grossly flawed study was a study done early on with the raw food feeding craze. And they actually did a study with a small sample of dogs. It was a very short period of time. They fed them raw food and then they checked their feces and found salmonella. And they freaked out. They said, oh my God, the salmonella, this is dangerous. They didn't mention, not one of the dogs were sick. Not one of them had diarrhea. They were perfectly fine. Now, if you're immunocompromised, I would suggest that you practice good sanitation. But you know what? That's a good idea, and you should be doing that no matter what, whether you feed your pet raw or not. Right. If you're picking up after your dog, you should practice good sanitation.
Right.
So, it was a stupid, ridiculous study to try to debunk the whole idea that raw food feeding was this horrifically dangerous thing. In fact, they took it a step further because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the American Veterinary Medical Association has really come out to vilify the use of raw food. And they have insinuated that if veterinarians are recommending raw food, that we could be putting ourselves at jeopardy for doing so.
Yeah, I've heard that, and it's really putting a lot of fear. It's interesting, though, because I was just on the FDA's website not even 2 weeks ago, and I was looking to see how many times kibble gets recalled for salmonella. And let me tell you.
A lot.
I mean, I heard, because people have been telling me, it was all kibble companies. It was kibble, salmonella. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, and what are these vets worried about?
The scare was all kibble.
Yeah.
It was kibble. I mean, that granted may have come out of China, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It was kibble.
That was in 2008.
Yeah.
Dee, I'm working on it, to be honest with you. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff. We both should write a book. She says, Carrie, write a book on your experiences. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff that we've both seen, I'm sure. What are your thoughts, Dr. Cannizzaro, on peer-reviewed stuff? I mean, what do you think about?
Depends on what peer is reviewing you. If you are a homeopathic veterinarian or a traditional Chinese medicine veterinarian, and you have, a veterinarian that vehemently hates any kind of holistic medicine, do you honestly think that peer review is going to be anything positive? Now, holistic veterinarians will sometimes peer review also. I would argue that probably they are more objective, or we are more objective. But peer-reviewed studies have their own set of flaws. But remember, we're human beings doing studies, and we make mistakes, we make errors in judgment, we make incorrect conclusions. I mean, anybody that's been breathing and has been alive and has learned to do various things through your lifetime, you can't tell me you haven't ever made any mistakes.
Right.
So why we think that for some reason a scientific study doesn't have any bias in it, doesn't have any opinions in it, any ulterior motives in it, such as getting paid by the pharmaceutical company to test that particular drug. I don't know what planet you're on, if you think that there's complete objectivity and that there is complete transparency, complete honesty. And even the best of investigators, just like the one that I was so blessed to work with, I mean, even for the drug we used, he tried every which way to Sunday. We sat down in a meeting together and he said, I've analyzed this every which way I possibly can think to analyze it. And sadly, I just have no statistical evidence that this medication is in any way helpful or, it lowers blood pressure or does anything except maybe prematurely kill the rats in the study. And basically, he was worried. And he said, I'm worried because they gave us a really big grant and I don't know if they will give us anything else. And this is how I'm paying you. This is how we're getting paid. And we had a discussion about that. I don't think most investigators are transparent in that way. I would say that they are not. He was legitimately concerned. He didn't want us to lose our jobs. He probably was going to keep his because he worked for the University of Florida anyway, but he could lose his laboratories. We had 2 laboratory rooms and, he had a PhD working for him as well. And then a couple of us. So, if you think that that is just not in any way biased, you're just not living on the same planet.
Yeah, it's hard. I have a good friend of mine who had to sit on a case for some opioids, but it was actually, I can't remember which one. And I remember him calling me and telling me how disgusted he was at the findings of how much everything was skewed in their favor, that they knew people were going to die on this drug, but they would pay out less. And it was right there in writing. Like they knew that they skewed the studies. They did everything they could. And this was human. This was human drugs. And you think if they can get away with that in a human way and know that
the work that I was doing was in humans. I mean, we were using animals for research, but it was all human.
Yeah, see, that's why it's just
absolutely. And there were techs that confided in me that their investigator, one in particular, she was so upset because the MD said, you need to fix these numbers so this drug looks favorable, or you're going to lose your job. And she's like, what do I do? And I said, I would go with your conscience. I wouldn't change numbers. I wouldn't do it. I don't know what she ended up doing. She didn't lose her job, at least not right away. But that was so disturbing to me. I was so ignorant that actually happened. I believed, like so much of the public, that, this was just a gold standard of, and of course, I worked with an investigator that was truly amazing and not only set up really good studies and sound studies, but, he also was honest about the data and he wasn't going to falsify data. Data gets falsified. And if you don't think the pharmaceutical companies absolutely want their drugs and to put more and more and more vaccines and drugs out there and portray them as safe with small, meager studies that are flawed or may have falsified data, you're living in an alternate reality. And I can tell you from behind the scenes, it happens. It happened right next door to me. Thankfully, it didn't happen with me. I'm glad nobody asked me to falsify data. I turned in the data that I had, and my MD boss, he never asked me to change a thing.
That's
he
good.
said, well, this is what we have. So
yeah. Going just real quick, Jen has 2 boxers, and she just is saying, isn't taurine, going back probably to our DCM that we were just talking about with the studies that were being done with DCM, she says, isn't taurine the most important for our dogs?
Well, everything a proper nutrition is important for our dogs and our cats. And I would argue that kibble, canned foods, even mostly freeze-dried foods, I mean, they're not 100% complete. They're really incomplete.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of taurine as an amino acid, and there's plenty of it in meat. But when you process and render meat down to, just a bubbly mess of yuck, dehydrate it and put it through high heat to stick it together in a kibble, and then spray some nutrients on it and put it in a bag so you can spend a lot of money on it. I would argue that that is insufficient nutrition. And we see it every single day with animals: dry hair, itchy skin, flakiness, coats that are dull, dry, animals that have digestive ailments, poops that are abnormal, breath that's bad, dental tartar buildup, you name it, a ton of different diseases. Would I be surprised that there could be dilated cardiomyopathy from kibble? That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I don't know that it was from kibble. It was a flawed study, so I don't know.
Well, it's interesting too when you do kind of talk about the DCM. Dogs have had DCM before grain-free food came out on the market. Like, DCM has been around long enough for UC Davis to have done the study many, 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 many moons ago. They did the study on it, finding out that cats needed more taurine, and like that
Right.
happened so long before I think I was even a vet tech when that first study was coming out of UC Davis. So I think that's one of the things too that we're not talking about is I could feed my golden retriever right now, which is high on the list for DCM, the best diet available, and she could still get DCM, right? Like, it's not always caused by, it could be a genetic thing, is from my understanding, is it's not always a food.
Well, it can be. I mean, ultimately, animals and people have certain genetic tendencies. And your genetic tendencies are going to get turned on or turned off depending on what you do. So if you live a stressful lifestyle and you eat poorly and you don't get enough sleep or exercise, etc.,
Right.
you're going to be more likely to suffer from an ailment, especially if you're genetically sort of programmed toward it. I think the thing that's missing here so much is that we didn't have hyperthyroidism and dilated cardiomyopathy. I remember when I was growing up, well, in the early days, because it did change pretty quickly when I was growing up. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough. We fed scraps and, like real food.
Yeah.
And I don't remember any of those diseases. Nobody had itchy skin, and, nobody got Cushing's disease that I could ever remember. Nobody got hyperthyroidism. Cats were fine. Our barn cats would go catch, birds and, rabbits and mice. And, they seemed really, really healthy. They didn't need, annual dental cleanings. They didn't need any of that stuff.
Right.
And if they had diarrhea, I guess with our barn cats, maybe we wouldn't know. I don't know. But I don't remember our dogs going in all the time because they had diarrhea and had to get their, metronidazole, or the other drug of the day. We didn't have metronidazole back then, but we didn't have those kinds of things. It just didn't happen often.
Right.
If we factor in the fact that we have absolutely exponentially exploded how many vaccines we have on the market that are pushed to animals and people, if we also take into consideration the push toward mass farming and limiting crops, so we have no crop diversity, the introduction of glyphosate, which is creating GMOs, gene manipulations in animals and fruits and vegetables to make them more resistant to whatever. If you take all of that stuff into consideration, the pesticide use, which is in line with glyphosate also, and now the explosion of drugs and flea and tick medications, I'm really shocked any animal would walk around or person could walk around and be even remotely healthy.
Yeah.
The air that we breathe, the soil that we live in and on, that we grow from, that is deficient. When I was growing up, it was less so. I mean, I can remember we had fresh, unpasteurized milk delivered to us. In a cute little, like metal box that had some, like insulation. In the glass bottles and that kind of thing. So we're becoming a sicker society. And those genes, if you have a propensity, whether it's genetic or not, if you have a genetic propensity, that's going to get turned on. It's going to take so much GMOs, so much smoking, so much exposure to toxins, to pesticides, etc. It's going to take so much, family strife, alcohol, poor food and diet, GMOs, vaccinations, stressors in life. We just went through a huge one with the pandemic. So we're going to take all of those and it makes people overtly sicker and will express diseases with much more intensity. I mean, I used to get cases of early in my veterinary career. I guess I shouldn't talk it up, but maybe like in the late 90s, I remember we were starting to see like inflammatory bowel disease, which probably started out as a vaccine-induced disease and still in large part is, but it also can be from GMOs and many other causative factors. But I used to see like inflammatory bowel disease and itchy skin, and I'd be like, oh, this is fabulous. I can I'm going to improve the diet, treat homeopathically, and these are easy peasy.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Now these cases are getting harder and harder to treat. And I argue probably in humans as well, because we have all of those aforementioned things I've said to you that are disadvantaging the organism, whether it's an animal or a person, to be healthy enough to overcome any of these ailments. There's a bombardment. Do we really have foods, even if they're labeled organic, that are not contaminated with glyphosate? In fact, I think there was a study done. There's an enormous amount of glyphosate in humans.
Yeah.
Enormous amount. And not only that, but even in babies. Yeah. Newborn babies are getting it from their mothers.
That's what I've been saying, is that generationally, our animals and our humans, we're just being born sicker. We're just sicker when we're coming out of the womb. When you get that puppy, I was just had this comment the other day. If I were somebody who were looking to purchase a puppy from a breeder, I would make damn sure that breeder is not feeding kibble, has not over-vaccinated mom, has not put flea and tick stuff on her. And hopefully I can get a puppy that is like 5 or 6 generations back through that. Because you get them now, and you're right. They're like already, like when I was a vet tech, we didn't see Cushing's disease. We didn't see cancers in young pups. We saw cancers.
No, I didn't. It was rare we would see a case of lymphoma in a young animal.
I never, ever saw lymphoma.
Rare. That was extremely rare.
Yeah.
And now it's almost rampant. I mean, I think I have I have somebody coming with a boxer in the near future. I think her boxer is only 7 years old, I think, and has mammary cancer. What's you have to say, well, are we really getting healthier? No, we might be living longer, maybe, but we're not living better longer. No. We're living worse. We're living with dementia. Where do you think dementia comes from? We didn't have dementia in animals. Not when I was early in my veterinary career. We didn't have dementia. That was rare if they had a brain tumor, dementia, Cushing's disease, pituitary tumors that would cause, some marked behavior disturbance and cognitive disorders, etc. We didn't have that. I mean, it just didn't. And, maybe the worst thing that happened is an animal got hit by a car.
I was just going to say, that's how our animals died. They got hit by cars.
Yeah, not a nice thing to say, but yeah, it was probably the biggest emergency visit was going to be trauma, hit by car, kicked by a horse. I don't know, be something like that.
Blockage because they ate your shoe or
that too, right?
Good blockage, a lot of blockage. I mean, like older dogs would get we would have some heart issues. Yeah, like, but yeah, now it's just I see sick puppies.
Well, I mean, I'm in business. I see sick puppies every day. And understand it takes many generations of not feeding kibble, not vaccinating, and feeding really good food and not using pesticides in order to get yourself a maybe somewhat healthy puppy or kitten. Now I just feel it's a given. So sometimes people say to me, well, I just want to go buy a puppy or a kitten because, I want to start out healthier. And I said, good luck. That's why I have no problem adopting from the shelters because I know
you have the same chance. You have the same chance.
Get sick from a breeder. I'm going to get sick animal from one of those places. I'd rather rescue one and do my best to try to clean up, mop up, give them the best loving home I can, treat them with the best care that I possibly can. That's why I love the seniors.
Yeah.
I mean, I foster the seniors, adopt the seniors when I can. I love the seniors. And I encourage people to do that. Don't think you're going to get a cleaner pet by going through a breeder,
No.
because it just doesn't. And of course, we have backyard breeders, and that could be a whole nother
Unless
conversation.
you can find, I know that Dr. Roman had, it took her, I think, either 5 or 6 generations before she got a good biome coming out of them. She had to constantly like get them work towards getting a healthy puppy biome. And it took her, I think it was 5 or 6 generations, she said, before she thought she was having some healthy puppies.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
We
matter,
should
right?
speak
Whether
about
it's,
that. I know we should speak about that sometime. We'll
yeah.
do that we'll talk
Yeah.
about that sometime off.
So
It does take a lot of generations of not vaccinating. And even then, not vaccinating and not doing, crappy
right.
food, etc. But I want the listeners to understand that disease, from a homeopathic perspective, but it shouldn't be only from homeopathic perspective, is not just about physical ailments. We also have mental and emotional ailments. And so a lot of people, like for instance, I think I'm going to be one of the early people that's ever going to say it. I have seen and diagnosed autistic animals before, animals with ADHD. Um, that's not recognized in veterinary medicine, but I'm recognizing it in animals. And they may be perfectly physically healthy, but then they don't have this health mentally and emotionally. And they do respond to homeopathic treatment, but we see puppies that way. And breeders will sometimes do stupid things, especially like in Labrador retrievers. They have on purpose tried to breed the breed so they're perpetual puppies, and they never really kind of mentally mature. And that's why you can have these like goofy, like middle age labs, and they're like crazy, like puppies. Just like, oh, you got a friend. I
that's
love it.
CJ. This is CJ. She's a picky eater, and so am I. So my husband named her Carrie Jr.
Well, we should treat her homeopathically, because that's one of the chronic disease ailments. So we'll have to talk about that sometime. She's
Being
like
a picky
seriously.
eater, she loves tuna.
Oh, well, that's really healthy.
Fresh tuna. She
Yikes.
loves it. Yeah, she's got some weird, I don't know. She'll eat meat, and she doesn't like beef, but she loves rabbit. Oh my God, put rabbit in front of her. That's
It's
why
funny
I sit
because a
in
lot
this
of
chair.
cats like rabbit. A lot
She
a
loves
lot
it.
of cats do.
Yeah, she
Which
loves it.
I don't think it's a particularly bad meat to feed.
Yeah. She loves it. I've been looking more and more into tuna because it's the lowest phosphorus of the meats. It has really low phosphorus. So what are your thoughts on that?
You have to be really careful with the fishes because they're incredibly contaminated.
Yeah.
So if you want metals and GMOs, now farm raised fish is going to be loaded with GMOs because that's
Right.
all they feed. Never mind also pesticides and parasiticides and things, because they're very ill from being confined, just like any kind of confined farming. It's really awful. No other way
Yeah.
to put it. Our oceans are polluted. Our waterways are polluted. Um, Everything is more or less polluted, I'm so sorry to say.
No,
But
it's true.
fish, because of the shorter life cycle, that could be even more concentrated in fish. So metals and things like that are a real problem, especially mercury. Mercury is particularly high in tuna. So you'll see a lot of cats that have really bad gingivitis and stomatitis, super inflamed gums, painful mouths where the vet wants to rip all their teeth out. They're probably eating some kind of fish-based diet, which is
Yeah.
actually really interesting because, I mean, cats in the wild, they don't go fishing. They don't eat fish. The only reason that they probably even like it domestically is because it stinks. And cats like really stinky stuff.
Yeah.
So tuna is a big go-to if you have cats that really don't eat very well. But regardless of the low phosphorus content, that's fine. But you have a host of other problems that are a lot bigger than having a low phosphorus content.
Yeah.
So
It's
I,
interesting
I
because
always tell my clients to feed a minimal amount of fish and
yeah, she
wild
doesn't
caught
eat
only.
a lot, but tuna is her like go to. She'll go crazy over tuna, but I
Mhm.
am having a hard time. I was trying to find a cat food company that does like raw 100%, like the whole tuna is what I want. Like I want it all.
Right.
So, and I want it to be, you know, as fresh as I can get it and not farm rate, all the stuff I want to do, but I haven't been able to find too much. So there is
Well,
a
just be
butchery.
aware that even your wild caught and are still really laden with, and of course, if you're out on the, you're all the way out on the West Coast, so you have the fallout from Fukushima. Now that's not going to go away anytime soon.
I know.
Now you have radioactive issues on that coast, and of course we have a host of problems on our coast as well, but all kinds of, we don't even go there, but our waterways get dumped into by toxic chemicals constantly on
It's
a
so
daily
hard to
basis.
I get down that rabbit hole and I'm like, well, I just am not going to eat because there's no, there's just, what are my, like, sometimes I think like, are my how long could I survive without eating with, not getting cancer? Because even in our plants, you think you want to go full vegetarian and vegan and then you start getting down those rabbit holes. It is stressful to
Well,
think.
I know that
Very-
Dr. Pitcairn did a lot of research,
Yeah.
retrospective also.
I have one of his studies.
The lower you eat on the food chain, meaning plant-based, the
Right.
less toxicity you have.
Right.
It doesn't mean zero toxicity, and that is even taking into consideration if you don't eat organic. That's pretty amazing because they actually did dissections and measurements, etc., to determine that the higher on the food chain you are, the more concentrated glyphosates are in your system. So, my friends, we are the most poisonous, the very most poisonous, because we're at the very top of the food chain. So those of us who eat lower on the food chain, hopefully, are trying to mitigate those things. I always tell my clients we cannot live in a bubble. And what we need to do is to take care of the things that we can take care of. Because if you live on a golf course, which is a toxic waste dump, and you can't move, you do what you can. Don't spray your own lawn. Keep your pets away from the toxic golf course. It's so appealing to take a nice walk along the golf course. Not such a hot idea. Do what you can. Eat as best you can. Feed your animals the best you can within your resources. Get familiar with the Dirty Dozen. If you're not already familiar with that, look it up. And excuse me, those are vegetables and produce that you can more safely eat if they're not organic. That's what the Dirty Dozen are. And so eat organic, anything that is the Dirty Dozen. And that is a relatively small list. So it's not super small, and eat as much organic as you can and eat as low in the food chain as you can. It doesn't mean you all need to be vegetarians and vegans. I'd encourage it though. I think anybody that does eat meat does need to go to a slaughterhouse more than once.
Yeah.
You want to continue to eat meat, go to a slaughterhouse. I was forced to go in vet school. Not once, but I think 3 times.
Well, I'm looking into cricket diets for the cats. So I said this, I think in a couple of podcasts ago, I told everybody that I am looking at getting these crickets that I can release into my house, because every once in a while a cricket gets into my house and my cats will stalk it and eat it, which I'm happy, that's fine. But then I started to feel guilty. Oh my God, I'm going to kill all these crickets, because we're trying to create a garage for my cats. So I'm thinking, I have this vision of just releasing like 100 crickets that they can hunt. And I found out that crickets only live 90 days. So my plan is to buy them right before they were ready to die anyway. And then I wouldn't be killing them and my cats get to hunt. But
well, not to burst your bubble, but there are certain lizard species that supposedly live on crickets, and crickets are an incredibly inferior nutritional source.
Yeah.
There is almost nothing to them. And so what they do for lizards is say, well, no problem. You just sprinkle nutrition on top of the cricket and then feed it to your lizard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know, that's like kibble, isn't it? I mean, with the kibble is nothing nutrition. And then they spray nutrients on top of the kibble to give it some nutritional value.
Oh my gosh. Forever I have wanted to share this story. So I got to share this story with you guys. When my son was 6, he had a green frog, a tree frog, and he had a gecko. Do you know what those geckos are? It was the purpley, they're really pretty little geckos. So I thought I was going to have this teaching moment with my 6-year-old son. And so he asked me if I thought the green tree frog and the gecko could get along. And I was like, sure, maybe, let's find out. So the gecko, because I didn't know I was supposed to sprinkle the nutrition on top of his crickets, was kind of deformed. So he had like, he couldn't walk because I didn't know. I was learning. He was supposed to have calcium and all this other stuff. So he was kind of a deformed gecko. Well, and the green tree frog was just a baby. So I thought, let's do it. So I sat my son down and we got the gecko and the frog out of their little things. And I sat them down on his lap, one on my knee, one on his knee. And you guys could probably all guess what happened. But the green tree frog grabbed the gecko in his mouth so fast. My son starts screaming and crying. I am like not like, what am I going to do? I had to like get the frog, get the gecko out of his mouth. It was this whole thing. My son was so mad at me. He's like, Mom, you didn't know anything about frogs. Like, you're right.
Oh,
but that whole thing, this was so many years ago. I can't believe I just remembered that. But you're right. The crickets had to have, I was supposed to put calcium on them. And so I started doing that for the little lizard. He lived a long time, that little, even with the trauma of being in a frog's mouth for like probably what felt like forever, was probably a minute. But he was deformed. So he walked weird. But you're right. I guess crickets probably don't. I heard that they have a lot of protein in them, but I don't think they're a complete and balanced diet. But I heard that they do have.
They're not. You have to sprinkle calcium and some other nutrients because they're protein and, and some fiber. Pretty much it.
Huh. See, Lily says that she hears, this is why you don't know. Like, I heard 90 days and it made me feel better that if I feed my cats crickets, they weren't going to live very long. But Lily's saying 8 weeks. And you're right. They are making this cricket food, but it's I heard it was a kibble because I looked into it.
Oh.
But I heard it's a cricket type kibble food for dogs. And so I was out. The moment I heard cricket kibble, I was like, I'm out.
Yeah, it's probably a new, latest, greatest hypoallergenic, rare protein diet, I suppose.
Well, I was happy about it. Like, if we can get all the protein we need without killing, cows, and I was happy about it. But it didn't pan out for me. I made a couple of phone calls and I was like, no, not going to happen. Crickets flour in Snickers bars. Did you read that?
Whoa. Gross. Well, I guess it'll give some crunch to the Snickers bar.
Oh, gross. Yeah.
Well, you don't appreciate it because when I first moved to Florida, I grew up in Connecticut, and there were some roaches in Connecticut, and my boyfriend at the time had a apartment in New York City, and it was my first introduction to dinosaur roaches, because they live like, they just
are those the cicadas that you guys? What are those things Because I was doing.
Oh Lord! When I moved down to Florida, I had no idea we were going to have dinosaur roach-looking things. Of course, ours are called palmetto bugs. I think that's a polite way of saying this is a giant roach that can frickin' fly. And when I first moved down to Florida, there was one in my apartment, and I was so horrified. And I thought, okay, well, I balanced on the kitchen counter because it had gone up kind of high. And I had a fly swatter. Now that was a really fine idea. These things are like dinosaurs. And I went to get to swat it with the fly swatter, and the thing flew at me. Now I hadn't experienced roaches that knew how to fly. I about fell off the freaking counter, almost killed myself. The thing flew into the bedroom. It was a 1-bedroom apartment, and I couldn't even sleep that night because I knew this thing was. They're horrible.
That's when you burn your house down.
Pest control that comes regularly because. I just tell them I can't coexist with palmetto bugs.
Yeah. I remember doing a podcast with you one time and there was one in
the room. God, it got into my salad bowl. Oh Lord. I
shouldn't laugh, but that was
sitting next to me. I knew the thing was in there and I was praying that it was all gummed up with the salad dressing or something because they can move, and I mean move quickly. So, oh my Lord, that was really tough. You have no idea what I looked like when we were done with the podcast. I had to deal with that. That's pretty extraordinary. My office is a sunroom, so it's not really that hard for them to kind of make their way in. They're not the most sealed, types of buildings. That's where we are right now, is in my sunroom office. And oh my, luckily I didn't scream my head off in the middle of the podcast, because I'm the one that screams like, somebody is murdering me if I encounter a palmetto bug.
Yeah,
Ooh.
I'm not a bug person, and flying cockroaches sounds like the biggest nightmare. Like I could not.
No, they are
Sherry said she's
so.
staying in Ontario.
I don't blame you. Staying in Ontario is not a bad idea. It's so freezing there. There's just no bloody way those palmetto bugs would be all right.
There's no way.
And
Yeah, I just got back from Banff area, so I just was up in Calgary, and whew, it's cold up there. It's cold.
oh,
I felt like I didn't even need a big sign that said she's from California, because it had to be obvious to anybody, because I was so cold, and people actually were walking around with t-shirts, and I'm like, am I like it? What is happening up here? They thought it was a beautiful day, and I'm like 9 layers deep. You can't see my eyes. I'm like, it's cold.
well, I probably never really belonged in Florida, because if it drops down to, I don't know, like the 40s and 50s here, people just lose their mind, the Floridians. Yeah. I'm walking around with a t-shirt on because I'm comfortable. So I have no business being in Florida. In that, but I don't want to go up to the freezing temperatures of Connecticut. But it's so funny, the differences, like I'll go and have a lesson with my riding trainer, and she's all bundled up like, 4 or 5 layers. Now, granted, I'm riding and she's teaching sitting in a chair, so it makes a difference, but it's amazing. And I'm just like, you got to be kidding me. You're like all loaded up like that. Are you serious? Really? You're comfortable that way? Well, anyway, apparently so.
That's me. So,
yeah.
Well, I am going to let you go. It's a 5:15, and I always try to keep you only for an hour, because you guys have no idea how busy Dr. Cannizzaro is. And, she's literally usually trying to eat really quick before we go live. Like, poor thing.
Oh, I already did that. You just, my Chinese food is just out of visual range. And so my stuff's come in, and I was hoping I wouldn't be speaking to everybody with like fried rice in my teeth or something. So hopefully there was no evidence of that. I hope.
No evidence. It's just so amazing that you, you're free with your time to talk to us. And, but you do, you can do consultations online, right? So if somebody wants to do a write-up, how do they get a hold of you?
They can contact me via my office or through my website. And my office number is 352-796-2648. My web address is holisticvetcare.com, and that's spelled with a W in the front of holistic. I do phone consultations nationwide, but you would have to have a veterinarian you feel comfortable with in your local area for examinations, blood work, x-rays, emergencies of that kind. And then we do treatment over the phone together. And I always ask for all the doctor notes, including any and all test results. That gives me an idea of what has been seen, what examination findings, test results have occurred well before I've ever encountered. And I'm really blessed. I mean, I love the work that I do. I cause, in veterinary school, I always said, not always said, but an oath we took was above all, do no harm. And I can truly say that in this type of medicine, I do no harm. I can't cure every patient I come in contact with. I can't cure and reduce suffering instantaneously, but I can tell you this kind of medicine, homeopathic medicine, is so much more successful at treating underlying imbalances, treating before functional disease, structural disease sets in, and it's so rewarding to see the improvements, enormously rewarding. So I feel really blessed. If you're interested, check out my website. You also can check out theavh.org. That's theavh.org. That is a list of veterinarians. You can perhaps find one in your area, but be willing to do some traveling, because there's not very many of us in the United States. I don't know if we're down to maybe 1,000. I'm not sure, but I know it's not in the many thousands. I really wish it was. So go look for a homeopathic veterinarian. We're going to be the most holistic veterinarians you will find. The other veterinarians that do integrative work are allopathic veterinarians that are offering some natural modalities, but it's not the same treatment protocol at all, and not nearly as successful. In fact, sometimes it can cause as much harm. So I strongly advise you to look into that. There's also a terrific book that's referenced on my website. I encourage any of the listeners to read. And it's called Beyond Flat Earth Medicine, and it's written by an MD. His name is Dr. Michael Dooley, Dooley. And it's a fantastic 100-page read on homeopathic medicine. It's intended for all audiences. And it's a terrific little read that'll explain an awful lot about homeopathic medicine. So I highly, highly, highly recommend that. I also recommend Dr. Pitcairn's book and Dr. Don Hamilton's book. Both of those are referenced on my website. So you can find those on my website as well.
Good.
So.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Wonderful, wonderful questions. They're always helpful in kind of keeping this kind of going all over the map. Who knew I was going to share that story of my son and his frog and his lizard? Wasn't planned. So
well, I really didn't think the outcome was going to be precisely what you said. So that was some pretty quick acting on your part. I mean, had you not intervened, that could have been slurp and gone.
I hate to say it. If my son wasn't watching, it probably would have been slurp and gone. Like I'm not a lizard person, so I did it for him.
Because I had a lizard and I had a snake when I was, during and then after vet school. And I had a green iguana and I had a red rat snake. And I love the snake, but I apparently was not built for the carnivorous world because feeding my snake was traumatizing for me.
I couldn't do that.
So I ended up giving my snake to a student friend, vet friend, colleague of mine, and she was delighted to take the snake and feed my snake and take care of my snake forever because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it either. And my snake only wanted live prey, and I was like, one day I ended up, my snake didn't want the live mouse, and I had a mouse for a pet. And then I had the snake for a pet. And I said, there's something seriously the matter with this picture.
Yeah.
And the mouse didn't survive, which was really awful. But that's when I said, that's it. I'm going to have to give my snake up because I'm definitely not the girl that can feed, animals to other animals. I'm not that person.
Yeah, so, me either. Definitely not.
I know that's critical because I do raw feed my dogs, and that's feeding animals to animals. So I get that piece. But the live feeding of the snake, I couldn't do that. My empathy for the mouse was just too much. Yeah. So, and I have empathy for animals. I do want to switch my dogs over to Pitcairn's vegetarian recipes. I encourage everybody to try that out. And if you don't feed exclusively vegetarian or vegan to your dog, be cautious. It's not so easy to do in a cat. So work with a veterinarian on that, please. And I'd like to switch mine over to that. I think I'd feel better overall. They'd probably be healthier too. I've just been kind of stuck on the raw food thing for so long.
My dogs are eating a lot because of Dr. Pitcairn. My dogs are eating a lot more vegetarian type stuff. They're eating a lot more goat's milk than they used to.
Right. I feed that too. Well, I do the same. I've added a lot more vegetable matter and reduced the raw food.
Yeah.
But I'm still buying raw meat for my dogs.
Yeah. I don't think I will. I've said this before. I won't ever go full vegetarian on my dogs because I don't want to have to supplement my cats with some taurines, and I don't want to do supplements. That scares me. I just don't want to mess around with it. So, but I have greatly reduced the amount of meat my animals are eating for sure. And I do a lot of goat's milk. A lot of goat's milk because I know there are so much nutrients in goat's milk. Sherry, if you have the opportunity or anybody has the opportunity to get goat's milk from Solutions, it's that new dog food company called Solutions. I highly recommend it. I'm still, as a retailer, trying to get my hands on it. But anybody that's out there and you are doing goat's milk, I'm just going to give a little plug for Solutions because they are doing some amazing.
I'm not familiar with that. I get Answers unless I'm able to get fresh, organic, raw goat milk locally. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. And sometimes I can for a little while and then I can't. If I can get that, that's always my preference.
Yeah.
I don't think we have Solutions.
They're just doing some amazing work with some of the farmers that do the goats work, and they're doing a lot of research. They're coming up with some kidney diets, and they're pretty amazing company. I absolutely they're just not big enough yet to be everywhere, but and they will be, and the amount of research that they're doing is just phenomenal. So
Yeah,
definitely. Huh?
Did you say research?
I know, right?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Exactly. No, but you never know how to, but you just have to trust. I know a lot of people kind of behind the scenes with the solutions company. So that's where my trust is coming in with them.
Sure.
So it's kind of more of what I know of them than it is about their research.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, and Lily, I'm going to quickly answer you. Powdered goat milk is not nearly as helpful as raw goat milk. So your powder just doesn't have the beneficial bacteria and the cultures. It doesn't have any of that in it. So it's really not terribly helpful, in my opinion.
She says it's all she can find. So
yeah, I guess it's better than nothing, but I'm not sure how much nutritional value that really provides. Yeah. So I understand. Depending on where you are, it can be harder to find, good sources of things. And we don't have a lot of selection where I live. I'm in a fairly rural area.
Yeah.
And not a very progressive area, I might add. So that means that the better foods and selections don't necessarily occur in the less progressive areas. I don't want to offend anybody's sensibilities.
You got to buy a goat.
Yeah, no, honey, are you kidding? Do you know how many freaking animals I have? Are you kidding? We have 21 animals on this property. I think we got enough.
Yeah, I know. I keep saying
I want goats, though. Don't get me wrong. And when am I going to milk a goat? Hello?
I don't know. I want a goat. I want a goat so bad.
But I do too. I love goats. Yeah,
Dee has goats.
I have enough.
Dee's on here. She has Dee. She's been on here. She has a lot of goats.
Is Dee the one that's going to come and work for me?
No, that was Sherry. But Dee lives about 2 hours from you, so she may end up driving up. Yeah, she may end up driving up for you.
All over Florida and outside of Florida. So 2 hours is not that far.
You may get a chance to meet her someday, but she.
I hope so.
So, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here again. Dr. Cannizzaro, as always, it's such a pleasure and so eye-opening every time I talk to you with the information that you provide for us. So I can't thank you enough. Lori is behind the scenes. I always thank her because she's the one typing in all this information for us because I can't think and type at the same time. And I want you guys to have all this valuable information. I also want to thank you guys as the listeners, or I just feel like you're part of our group, but it's always so helpful, not just your questions, but when you are answering each other's questions, because sometimes we can't get to them fast enough, especially when we go off on our story tangents. Yeah. So it's really helpful to have you guys be part of this community and helping each other out and giving information. So I just want to thank everybody, and I will see you guys next week. Dr. Cannizzaro, any last minute things you want to say?
Well, I just want to thank you for having me. I always enjoy interacting with you. And I really do. And I hope that the information that we provide to people is of great value to you. I know that Carrie and I do this out of the kindness of our hearts. I'm sure the other vets do too. And, this is a way that I can give to the community. So here I am. It isn't all about the money.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. Thank you for saying that, because yes, the vets that I bring on here do this out of the kindness of their heart. It has nothing to do with money, but sometimes it costs money to treat an animal with products that cost money. You can't just, but a lot of free time.
An ability that I hope that I can bring some of my expertise, especially because homeopathic medicine is less well known, and help people to understand that you truly do have other choices. And you don't have to worry about working remotely with a homeopath. We can be very effective. And just as a last plug, we talked about wrapping up as far as research. Back in the in the early 1800s, I mean, the homeopaths, when Hahnemann discovered homeopathy, people would walk like days and days and weeks, to go and see him as a homeopath. And he just had to learn from treating patients. Yeah. And there wasn't any double-blind studies, and there was no less validity in how successful the treatment was. And it really took hold for quite some time in Europe and for a period of time in the United States until Western medicine, the youngest medicine we have, allopathic medicine, kind of stamped out everything possible holistically that it could, and really kind of wiped out the homeopathic schools, colleges, and hospitals that did indeed exist both in the United States and Europe. So there still are some, but they are hard to come by. And this is a very powerful medicine modality, and it shouldn't be overlooked. So I sincerely hope that for your own well-care as well as your pet's well-care, that you'll give this consideration, read the book, Beyond Flat Earth Medicine, come back and visit us, bring your questions. And Carrie, I'm going to drag you to the dark abyss of homeopathy if it kills me, right? So
oh no, I need to get there.
Yes.
I'm on board after I learned a lot from Dr. McCarran, and then through talking to you, I'm absolutely on board. It's just really difficult to that's why I bring you on, because I'm not, you guys, like, if you want to learn about your dog's skin microbiome, this groomer is all over it. If you want to learn about homeopathy, I have to defer to Dr. Cannizzaro, because it's so deep that it would require years and years and years for me to fully understand it, I think, because it's just that hard to do, which is why I value so much of your time that you've spent learning this, because I get it. It's not just diarrhea, here's a drug. It's just not that easy.
Right. Well, it's not a Band-Aid approach, and it's one of honestly the only medicines, and I'm not dissing traditional Chinese medicine. I have lots of Chinese herbs behind my head here. I'm trained in traditional Chinese medicine, but homeopathic medicine treats the underlying imbalance that produces symptoms. The symptoms aren't a disease, whether the diagnosis is cancer, allergies, or whatever it is. That's still a symptom of the underlying imbalance. And we as homeopaths are treating the underlying imbalance. Nothing in allopathic medicine does that. Nothing. And even going through veterinary school, I mean, I didn't know. I learned the Band-Aid approach, and I did that for the first few years out of veterinary school. And then I just thought there's got to be something better that makes more sense. So I encourage you to check that out for your own benefit, for yourselves, for your animals, and for the planet, because we're not polluting our aquifer with pharmaceutical drugs, which, by the way, that's what's in your water and in the ground also. So we're not polluting anything with homeopathy, and be more effective in medicine and relieving much more suffering for a larger swath of the population than I ever did in allopathic medicine.
Do you sell that book on your website, or can we get it on Amazon?
No, you could get it on Amazon. It used to be you could read it for free online as a PDF. I'm not sure, since a new edition came out finally, I'm not sure that you actually can. But the book is very inexpensive, and I encourage you to get it. It's a really terrific little read, and it'll give you a wonderful eye open into homeopathic medicine history, philosophy. It's not dry and it's not boring. It's actually a very interesting, really informative read that, like I said, is intended for all audiences. You don't have to be a scientist to read it.
Yeah.
So I read the book. It's worth it.
Yeah, I'll grab it and I'll let you know. And then when we reconvene,
please let me know.
When we reconvene, we can talk about it.
Yes. And when
maybe we'll have a book club. We'll turn this into a book club.
Okay, we could do a book club. I give handouts to my clients, and I always tell them, all right, the next time you come in, there'll be a quiz. And they get this like panicked look on their face, because I always figure that how many times do people really read the handouts? So hopefully more than I think, but it's
hopefully more than you think. Yeah.
I hope it's more.
All right, everybody. You guys have a wonderful evening. I will see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of you for coming on and taking your time with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Carrie.
You're welcome. Have a good evening. Bye, everybody.
All righty. Time for bed.